Hello and welcome to another episode of Chai, Children of Adam and Eve, on QF Radio 91.7 FM. A special dialogue program brought to you by Adil Khan of Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue. During the month of Ramadan, where we discuss research relevant to our lives today. We have in our studio with us Professor Reza Pirbhai, who teaches history at Georgetown University in Qatar. He has redefined the study of Islam in South Asia through using categories of analysis internal to Muslim debates themselves. Internal theological differences among Muslims to balance the reason-revelation relationship has been the core contribution of Reza's history writing. He now attempts at tracing the formation of modern Muslim thought from the lens of women. Another paradigm-shifting project, I believe. We welcome him today to the studio and begin the interview with a rather provocative question. Whose perspective to privilege in the writing of history and why? Welcome, Reza.
Thank you so much for having me. In answering your question, I'm reminded of a few words which one of my own professors had shared with me when I was a graduate student. He told me that writing history is like basically doing a jigsaw puzzle for which you don't have a picture and for which most of the pieces are missing. And so the lesson that you can take from this is that history is ultimately about perspective, because we have so many gaps in our knowledge. We're talking about a time and an era, generally speaking, where we have no direct access to the persons involved. And so the way in which we approach it is all important. The perspective that you bring to it, obviously, is always your own. It's rooted in the present, where you live. So the question becomes, how do you access the past and try and understand it as authentically as possible? How does it ultimately reflect the way that people themselves viewed their world, and not merely how you view them looking back through time? And the manner in which we can do that ultimately is determined by the various types of lenses, the various types of approaches which we can bring to historical study, which is obviously a matter of great discussion and discourse among historians.
But Reza, whose story does one tell in the telling of history? I would still repeat my initial question, contextualizing it on your current research interest, which is on women's role in the struggle for freedom in South Asia, for example. What is often told is a narrative where ordinary women are seen as the victims of communal violence. And that's the only story we hear about the role of women in the struggle for freedom in South Asia. So whose story do we decide to tell as historians? Is not that an important question as well?
Absolutely it is. I mean, generally speaking, the historical tradition has been focused on the elite. This is a function of the types of sources that are available. We are ultimately subject to the writings of court historians and philosophers and so on who are associated with various elite figures throughout time, and these are the works which we have access to. And so the story that comes out is obviously colored by that and reflects elite society. It's been basically since the 70s and 80s that there's been an alternative trend to say that history is missing out the bigger picture. For example, Howard Zinn wrote The People's History of the United States, or The People's History of America, which sought to view the history of the United States through the lens of the people at large rather than the policymakers sitting in Washington, D.C. And that meant bringing in women, bringing in Native Americans, bringing in African American narratives. The difficulty, of course, is accessing these narratives once you move outside the elite circle. But the importance of it, obviously, is unquestionable. It is obviously the task of the historian, particularly since the 70s and 80s, to define the past in terms of all the people who lived it, and not merely those who are in decision-making or policy-making or positions of power. And women, therefore, are one of the most important elements of any kind of historical understanding of the past, playing major roles throughout our various historical narratives of the world, but very understudied at the same time.
So your current study allows a different reading of women's role in the struggle for freedom, I believe.
Absolutely. I would, in fact, go beyond saying a different reading of women's role, but in fact a different reading of the entire narrative of nationalism in the South Asian context, particularly Muslim nationalism. By looking at the issue of nationalism through the lens of gender, it's not merely the role of women that's being highlighted, but in fact a bigger picture of how the entire movement came about, who its major players were, and the variety of ways in which different segments of society participated in that movement.
If you'd help us understand better what that counter reading or different reading would be for our listeners, that would be very helpful. Would it question the role of the narrative that we tend to hear about South Asian nationalism, which privileges a patriarchal view of the nation?
Absolutely, it does. Not only does it counter a simply patriarchal view, but in many respects, what it shows us is how that patriarchal view in itself shaped the role of women, and the various ways in which women tried to assert themselves and their interests, their wishes basically for what they want to see the nation become and be in the long term, while at the same time being heavily constrained by the larger narrative, which is always patriarchal.
So I would like to understand this in the broader framework of how patriarchy is understood in other historical studies. For example, in relation to religion, the name of Barbara Metcalfe comes to mind, and how patriarchy is demonstrated through religious narratives. Or perhaps in literature, the work of Priya Gopal comes to mind, and how she shows the progressive writers movement and the role of women in them. How would you place your work in relation to, for example, these two works?
Well, my work has benefited from a great deal of research that looks at the development of gender relations during the colonial period, which directly precedes the various national movements in South Asia, both Indian and Pakistani. What this research basically shows us is that women from the late 19th century on were heavily involved in social reform. Unfortunately, much of this social reform was dictated by the norms and power structures of Victorian society, the colonizers' society. And therefore, the kind of concerns that women were channeled into were also dictated by the colonial narrative, basically, in the colonial discourse. A good example of this is the heavy emphasis that was placed on parda, or veiling, in Muslim societies. In South Asia, in the pre-colonial period, we see various forms of modesty, basically dictating the place of women in public life. This could range from nothing more than wearing a type of attire that de-emphasizes the body, to being completely covered from head to toe with not one inch of skin being visible. Another interesting feature of the pre-colonial was that women could be from Hindu or Muslim backgrounds and share various forms of parda, various forms of veiling. So among elite women, associated with the Mughal state, for example, both Hindu and Muslim women associated with the court would very often be secluded from men in public life. On the other hand, if you go to the provinces, a place like Gujarat, you would see women who are very much part of public life and in no way constrained by the type of attire that they're wearing. And this would be shared by Muslim and Hindu. What changes in the colonial context is that Parda as an institution is essentialized as a Muslim and an Islamic dictate, basically. And as a result of this...
But by who?
By the British. In seeking to ultimately justify their rule by saying that we are here to liberate women from these oppressive measures that their indigenous societies and traditions put on them.
So the narrative which is more recent about the Taliban and the relationship with Afghan women is not something strange for history?
Not at all, not at all. In fact, this is something which we can see not merely in South Asia, but across the Muslim world. Lord Cromer, when he assumed the governor-generalship of Egypt, his line was, we're here to liberate Egyptian women from the oppressive customs that they live under as Muslims. And the prime feature that he ultimately emphasized was the veil, that we have to liberate women from the veil. But of course, for British society, at that time, British women didn't have property rights, whereas Muslim women did have property rights. So while speaking about liberation from the veil, at the same time, various governor-generals of the British Empire in the Muslim world were curtailing the property rights of women, saying that this is uncivilized behavior and that women should not have property rights if they're going to be civilized. So the entire discourse is ultimately shaped by these colonial measures and reforms being put in place by the various colonial states in different contexts. For me, looking at South Asia, of course, it's the British Empire. And what we see as a result of this, therefore, is a heavy emphasis placed on issues such as veiling, which previously had not been part of the literature of Muslim law, part of the literature of Muslim reform movements, stretching back through various centuries. Now it became a very important feature. And so, on the one hand, you have a reactionary movement from Muslims saying, well, who are you to mess with us? And therefore emphasizing veiling in areas that it previously hadn't been. And on the other hand, women now being directed to think in terms of veiling as the great symbol of their oppression that they are going to counteract. A wonderful example of the kind of literature that issues from this is a novel by Ruqayya Hussain, a Bengali Muslim woman who wrote in the late 19th century, a novel called Sultana's Dream, in which she basically set up a fictitious scenario in which men were in veil and in seclusion, and women were the ones who were out in the public sphere. And her basic discourse is that the basic lesson she's trying to convey is, look at the oppression that exists, and would men allow this to be the condition under which they live, and therefore why are they ultimately promoting this among women? So there's a very confused and in many respects multifaceted discussion that arises out of this. And related to this, then, if you're going to be promoting seclusion, if you're going to be promoting veiling, is what role are women going to play in the public sphere? What role are they going to play in the rising nationalist movements in South Asia? And women basically took it upon themselves, beginning in the early 20th century, to argue that whether we're in veils or we're not in veils, this is a separate issue which can be debated, neither needs to limit our participation in the political sphere. In fact, it is through participation in the political sphere that we would be able to ultimately play a role in determining whether veiling is or is not incumbent on all of us as Muslim women.
If we understand your work, if you'll allow me to put it in these words, that how people talked about women. If we now go to a second way of thinking about the same question, which is how women spoke about themselves, would that help to understand a more accessible lens of womanhood, or how woman as a person sees herself as a modern woman in the emerging nationalist movement in South Asia?
Yes, obviously we'd like to think so, because by accessing women's voices, such as the novelist I mentioned, Ruqayya Hussain, what we're getting is an insight into how women themselves are, on the one hand, entering the discourse and trying their best to have a voice in that discourse, but at the same time how their own voices are also limited by and shaped by the broader patriarchal narrative that's in place. One that is shaped by the colonial state, one that is shaped by the male members of their families, society at large. And this is one of the most difficult aspects of the work that I'm undertaking right now. To what degree am I seeing women's voices representative of liberation and emancipation versus women's voices in various respects repeating power structures or reinforcing power structures that are already there?
Narratives or positions by politicians themselves, Indian politicians themselves, who take on a liberatory position. I would imagine Jinnah might be one of them.
Absolutely. There's an interesting episode. In 1937, the nationalist movement was just taking off. The Pakistan movement was just taking off. And Jinnah and his sister Fatma traveled to Baluchistan to try and muster support for their movement in that region. And there we had a very heavily custom-bound tradition of seclusion for women. And as a result of this, before one of the major meetings, a debate ensued between him and his sister and his hosts there, Muslim Leaguers, of whether his sister Fatma should appear on the stage beside him or not. Fatma was a woman who never veiled, and that was a function of the fact that she's a Gujarati Khoja. The Jinnahs are Gujarati Khojas, and there was no tradition of veiling in their community. This debate ensues, and ultimately it was the Baluchi wife of the host who said, Fatma should be on stage, because ultimately what we're trying to convey is a very different image of the modern Muslim woman, and to reflect the reformist movements that are taking place at the time. His first reaction, Jinnah's first reaction, was to shirk this suggestion and to say that this might undermine the great work that the Muslim League has been doing in winning support in Baluchistan. But ultimately it seems that his sister Fatma is the one who told him, no, that we should be ultimately putting forward a variety of alternatives. And that doesn't mean that if it's the local tradition to veil, that women should throw off their veils. But on the other hand, if we are standing for progressive modern Islam, and that is what we focus as part of the Muslim nationalist movement, then we should also be at liberty to portray the opposite, which is a woman who is not veiled. And from that moment on, basically, by the way, Fatma did appear on stage without a veil, and from that moment on, what we see is Muhammad Ali Jinnah making a very conscious effort to ensure that there are always unveiled women participating in all public gatherings that he attended, the major annual conferences of the Muslim League and so on. At the same time, there were other women who were part of the women's reform movements who were joining the Muslim League at the time, who then started pressing to have a women's subcommittee be part of the Muslim League. And that was founded immediately after the Baluchistan meeting in 1938 or so. And from then on, you start to see women who are organizing as members of the Muslim League on a substantive basis, a policy-making basis, from that time on. And as a result of that, when the independence of Pakistan is finally achieved in August of 1947, there's absolutely no debate about the women's right to vote in the new state. There's no question about women participating in the Constituent Assembly, drawing up the constitution of the new state, and a very different milieu basically is heralded. Now, I don't want to make it sound like everything is hunky-dory and going in the right direction, of course. There's a great deal of resistance to all of this from certain quarters within the Muslim League, from clerical classes and so forth as well at the same time. So it's a battle that's taking place.
You are listening to Chai, Children of Adam and Eve on QF Radio 91.7 FM, a special dialogue program brought to you by Adil Khan, where we are discussing today Writing Different Histories with Reza Pirbhai. Reza, a victimhood of South Asian women as a result of the communal violence of the partition, which we haven't talked about at all. And I wonder, is it that you completely do not want to tackle that area which is very hotly debated at all, or would you reread that area with picking out narratives from around that period and around those discussions? Because I'm particularly interested in your views about how elite women like Fatma Jinnah herself and people like her, who were part of the committees of the exchange for women after the partition, who were left behind or who are subject to kidnappings by the different communities, how they get talked about and get objectified almost as bodies which need to be exchanged between states. And what is your position on that narrative and on that debate?
First of all, I would say there's absolutely no question about the fact that women were particularly victimized during the partition violence. In a patriarchal society, we've seen this in various instances. Consider even more recent cases such as Bosnia, where women were particularly picked out in the ethnic conflict that ensued there and the religious conflict that ensued there, and targeted as a means of undermining the very societies, Bosnian Muslim society as an example. So there's a long history of this, and in partition violence, Muslim women, Hindu women, Sikh women, all of them were particularly targeted by the opposite male community as means by which to undermine the sanctity and dignity of the opposite number. What's left out of the narrative, however, is that in the rehabilitation of these women, here we see women themselves playing a leading role. Okay, so people like Fatma Jinnah and the Women's Relief Committee, at a later date, which was ultimately the cornerstone or the foundation of the All Pakistan Women's Association. These kinds of organizations, which were entirely women-run, organized, and active, played a major role in terms of providing relief. At the same time, we also have organizations such as the Women's National Guard being founded, which is promoting the idea of training women in combat so that in future, if any of these kinds of attacks take place on their community, women themselves will be able to defend themselves against the aggressor in that context. All of these kinds of initiatives were largely run by, financed, and organized by women themselves. And in terms of the women that we could identify, we're not just talking about elite women in the high ranks of the Muslim League or from large landed families and so on, but we're talking the brunt of the work being done by bourgeois women, by women from the civil wives of members of the civil service, women who were wives of military officers, lawyers, doctors, and so forth. This extends not only to relief work, but also then the establishment of industrial homes so that women who have been displaced or who have lost their family, the bread-earning men, will be able to have access to education, have access to vocational training so that they can stand on their own feet and be economically viable on their own without the need for men to ultimately support them in the long run.
About the rehabilitation process, have you looked at all the issues related to how the framing of the two states, Pakistan at that time, East and West Pakistan combined, and India, how they exchanged women as it were, get back their women from the other state? Is that a problematic event which needs to be thought about as well?
Yes, there is the question of exchange, and there's also the question of women from both communities ultimately ending up assimilating into the opposite community. So many Muslim women were not exchanged. The vast majority that were disassociated from their community by being abducted and raped and so on would end up being assimilated into the opposite number. As far as exchange goes, just today, in fact, I was reading some documentation which looked at various attempts for the women working in Pakistan to go to Delhi and go to Bihar and go to West Bengal and so on to access the refugee camps that were there and ultimately work towards the movement and transport of the abandoned women or the displaced women in these camps into East or West Pakistan at that time. What was happening in terms of the Indians, the Hindu or Sikh communities, in terms of the rehabilitation and movement of women from their communities to India is not something I can comment on. But certainly in terms of the Muslim community, a great deal of effort was put into this. And again, women were not just bystanders here, they were playing a leading role in terms of the rehabilitation and relocation of displaced women as well.
Continuing on the Fatima Jinnah question, she's of course a figure who is way before Benazir Bhutto, a woman leader in Pakistan and perhaps the first one in the Muslim world, who takes on a leading role in electoral politics, who starts a movement of an opposition to a military dictator at that time, a military general at that time, who is the president of that country. So how do you see her role, as it were, her problematic role sometimes, because she was someone who split Pakistan into perhaps two halves over the question of the woman in the public sphere?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a vital question, and one of the reasons why I undertook this project in the first place. The greatest amount of documentation on Fatma Jinnah's life is from the period, the 50s and 60s, when she became politically active in her own right, rather than alongside her brother. As a result of this, what I see is a very interesting set of questions arising, and they obviously follow from earlier questions about women in the political sphere and women in the public sphere, and what role should they play. And as I said earlier, basically by the time Pakistan is founded, the question of women playing a role in the political sphere is already, for many of the educated classes, bourgeois and up, already settled. There are women in the Constituent Assembly and so forth. But by the mid-50s or so, we start to see a huge pushback from elements that would like to limit the public role of women in Pakistani society. And that pushback is coming from a number of quarters. It's coming from clerical classes, particularly Deobandi schools, Salafi movements, and so forth, who are not happy with the role of women in political life. We also see pushback coming from certain more traditional quarters in terms of the landed elite, for example, who are making a great push to rationalize their place in and power in Muslim society based on tradition, based on their hereditary traditional roles as local landlords and so on, in a very patriarchal setting.
But wasn't it Maududi himself who personally was in conflict with Fatma Jinnah, and perhaps the woman question was secondary?
It's interesting that Maududi and the Jamaat-e-Islami were supporters of Fatma Jinnah when she finally did run. But the condition under which Maududi issued a fatwa saying it's legitimate for Fatma Jinnah to run is interesting in itself. He basically argued that in times of great need, a woman should be able to run and hold the position of head of state. Not head of government, head of state. Okay. So it's a conditional acceptance that Maududi was making. At the same time, however, as we know, at later dates, the Jamaat-e-Islami, when talking about Benazir Bhutto, argued that a woman should not even be head of government, let alone head of state. And Fatma Jinnah was running for president, not prime minister. So we can see here, in fact, that ultimately political considerations are playing a very heavy weight and voice in determining from these quarters what role women should play, rather than a purely doctrinal question being asked.
Thank you, Reza. Thank you for helping us clarify the many intricacies of early modern and modern South Asian studies of Islam in South Asia, particularly in Pakistan. And we are really grateful for the time that you've given us today to talk us through these ideas and through your research as well. And would you like to say something to our listeners as well as perhaps you'd like to wish them for Ramadan?
Yes, I'd like to thank you and everyone here at Qatar Foundation Radio for inviting me to speak. It's been a great pleasure, and I'd like to wish all the listeners Ramadan Kareem.
Thank you, and thank you for listening to us today, and we wish you all a happy Ramadan. And a special thanks to Ehab al-Sheikh for bringing this program to you.